change for increased community and the campus climate. We arrived at three what I believe are compelling pillars for the Inclusive Excellence Action Plan. And they are community, thriving, and wellness. When we launched the action plan, at that time, no one, certainly not me, had predicted that we would have to confront a global pandemic, economic uncertainty, and a reckoning about systemic racism. But as I hope to show, those three pillars have taken on more relevance and more urgency, particularly as we return to in-person working and learning here at UCI. I just want to briefly describe some high points of actions that we've taken over the course of this period to advance a culture of inclusive excellence that's grounded in community thriving and wellness for all members of the campus community. For the community, we launched a OIE data dashboard, as well as a climate survey. And we did that because we wanted to listen and learn about how people are experiencing UCI in relationship to these three pillars. We also launched an Inclusive Excellence Certificate program. This is a 20-hour program that is a certificate program that's open to all staff employees, faculty employees, graduate students, and undergraduates and alumni. What's striking is that we've hosted well over 1,300 members of the campus community, and we've awarded over 400 certificates to those who've completed the three courses. We also launched last year another set of learning tools entitled Anti-Blackness in the United States. And this was in response to the reckoning on systemic racism. And I have to say, I've been incredibly gratified by the response. More than 800 people have completed at least one of the three modules that last 5 hours. And close to 1,500 people have signed the Black Thriving Pledge. Climate also takes on other forms of activities. We have encouraged the development of climate councils, both in our academic schools, but also our non-academic units. The idea behind creating climate councils is to leverage change through our collective efforts. And that extends working with deans, vice chancellors, staff assembly, the academic senate, student government, both at the undergraduate and graduate level. And so we've done a lot of purposeful activity, evidence-based practices-driven interventions. I want to turn now to thriving, because just as we believe that all members of the campus community should experience belonging not only to their academic unit, but also where they work, but also to the larger community of UCI. We also believe that our students and employees should thrive. And thriving takes many forms. And I just want to highlight a number of initiatives that really are about promoting thriving. One of the first that we launched was the Latinx Thriving Initiative, as the campus secured federal designation of a Hispanic serving institution. We also, as part of becoming an Asian American, Native American, Pacific Islander serving institution, adopted an API Thriving initiative that we have documented in an associated report. And underlying both of these initiatives is the idea that we want to mobilize talented people from a broad cross-section of society so they can maximize their potential at UCI. That was the driving motivation behind the Black Thriving Initiative. It not only builds on our campus commitment to inclusive excellence, but it was our campus response to the reckoning on systemic racism in the United States. The Black Thriving Initiative consists of three broad arguments. The first is that anti-Blackness poses an existential threat to our mission as a public research university. The second reason is that the Black Thriving Initiative is our campus response to the reckoning on systemic racism. We want to leverage our capacity as a great public research university to create a culture where Black people thrive. And the final reason why we launched the Black Thriving Initiative is because it builds on our commitment, an enduring commitment to inclusive excellence. The Black Thriving Initiative consists of three action platforms. I will only briefly describe them. Information has been made available in the chat regarding the link that will take you to the website. The first action platform for the Black Thriving Initiative focuses on culture change. And at the heart of culture change is that accountability begins with understanding. Understanding what is anti-Blackness. And for that reason, as I alluded to earlier, we launched a series of modules to raise awareness and understanding about what anti-Blackness is. They are free. They are open to the entire UCI community, including the alumni community. It is a remarkable format where we learn together. We also have a second action platform, and that is to leverage our research and teaching mission to advance understanding about the Black experience and drivers of well-being. And here I just want to allude to the call for the BTI Faculty Cluster Hiring Program. Provost Stern announced the first allocation of 4 FTE to support a hiring cluster around environmental health disparities. And that cluster consists of public health, engineering, social sciences. And I'm also delighted to add that the School of Medicine is also participating in this larger area effort to understand the environmental factors that face health outcomes. And I finally want to move on to the third area, and that is to link UCI's future by supporting the success of Black communities. And here we've done a considerable amount, but I just want to point out that the programming that we have developed that draws on our academic units, our student affairs professionals, is available to everyone. And it forms a bridge that connects UCI to the wider community. It connects us to the 60,000 Black people who call Orange County home. It creates opportunities for connection for the 3 million or so Black people who live in California and many more who live across the United States. Finally, one of the more, I think, important new initiatives that we're developing for the coming academic year is to pilot a staff equity fellows program. And that is really modeled on our faculty equity advisor program, but it's focused on our career staff. And their role is to sort of grow the capacity of UCI to diversify leadership, particularly in the non-academic areas, but also the academic areas as well. We'll be reporting back to the campus in the fall about further details. Finally, I want to move to wellness. And if there ever was a time when wellness matters, it's now. And I'm particularly grateful to have partnered with the Office of Equal Opportunity and Diversity for their work in examining the National Academy of Science and Engineering and Medicine recommendations for additional approaches to prevent sexual harassment and sexual violence. This is a priority of the campus, and our focus will not be taken away from this. I also want to bring to your attention that recently, in fact, I believe at the end of this of August, UCI joined the Okinawa Charter. And we join a growing number of research universities across the United States and in fact, internationally, to commit to building a health promoting culture. I want to acknowledge the many members of Student Affairs who played such an important role in preparing the campus for joining the Okinawan Charter. And we'll be reporting back on our efforts later in the fall quarter. But now what I'd like to do is to turn to our panel, to turn to considerations about inclusive excellence as we embrace the new academic year. And what's striking is that all of us in one way or another have really had to respond, learn, adapt through this novel culture that we are experiencing. And so I'm particularly pleased to introduce three colleagues from respective areas of student affairs, the UCI Staff Assembly and the UCI Academic Senate. Their biographies are included in the Institute materials, but suffice it to say they each have provided distinguished leadership for years at UCI, and in their current roles serve key constituencies. Edgar Dormitorio is Assistant Vice Chancellor and Chief of Staff in the Division of Student Affairs. Amanda Garcia-Hall is Department Administrator in the Department of Health, Society, and Behavior in the Program of Public Health. And Joanna Ho is a Professor of Accounting and former Equity Advisor for the Paul Maraj School of Business and is the Chair of the UCI Academic Senate. Please join me in welcoming these colleagues to this conversation. And so I want to begin with a question that I want to invite each of the panelists to sort of consider and reflect on. And as you reflect on this, I want to urge audience members to submit questions and answers in the question and answer chat feature. And here's the question. What surprised you going through the last 18 months in your role at UCI? And I'd like to start first with you, Edgar, in your role in student affairs. What surprised you going through the last 18 months in your role at UCI?
I think after, Doug, thank you. And thank you for the introduction. And thank you to everybody who with us here today. I mean, it's an honor to be able to spend some time with you to share some of our thoughts of the work that we're doing around the division, and for us in particular, the work that we're doing to support our students here. Doug, I think after the past 18 months, I shouldn't be surprised anymore. There are so many things that have happened over the last 18 months, but I think I'm really, I'm in awe of both my colleagues that have worked tremendously over this period of time. And I'm also in awe of the students who demonstrated some incredible flexibility and understanding during this time, in which I think pivot was one of those main words that we used throughout this period. And so we're finding ourselves continuing to pivot, and there's a few more pivots left, I think, as we begin this school year. But not so much of a surprise, but I think just a sense of gratitude with my colleagues and the students that we work for.
Thank you. You know, Amanda, I want to do a word association test for you in your role in Staff Assembly. Pivot. What do you think about?
Sure. Well, I got to say I've come from finance, so my first thought was pivot tables, but But yes, definitely, I think we are always having to be very flexible right now, more so than we experienced previously. And I think I've just seen that a lot with our staff. So our staff on staff assembly, we obviously have these large events that we typically would do, our staff appreciation picnic, we'd have our staff breakfast. And so, things had to become virtual and very quickly. And I'm just impressed with how our various events committees were able to shift and provide some resources online, like lunches with leadership and virtual scavenger hunt that they did during Staff Appreciation Week.
Wow. Wow. So it's really created a lot of resourcefulness, this idea of pivoting and finding the depths of our capacity to sort of adjust and change. And Joanna, I want to turn to you in your role as the chair of the Academic Senate and ask the same question. What surprised you when you reflect on the past 18 months? And I imagine when you were elected by your colleagues as the chair of the Academic Senate, you didn't anticipate this, did you?
Sorry, I forgot to unmute myself. Okay, and actually, that I was not surprised. Okay, but I think I'm proud of have witnessed faculty, staff, administrators come together and work around the clock, address the various challenges concerning instruction, research, and student support over these past 18 months. That was really a challenging time. But I think I really observed the resilience from all different, the colleagues and the staff administrator. I was superly impressed.
The one takeaway from your observations is that in some sense, when we recruit people, whether career staff, employees, faculty employees, in some sense, of course, it's based on what they've achieved, but also on their promise. And what I'm hearing from each of you is that in some sense, this incredibly demanding period has really revealed the remarkable nature of people that we work with, who are our coworkers, who are our colleagues, who really take this mission to advance research, teaching, and service and enact it under any circumstances. And for the benefit, in particular, of our students, our undergraduates and graduate students. And I want to be sure to acknowledge that these incredible young people have revealed the confidence that this campus has seen in their applications over the past 18 months. I can only imagine how challenging that is to experience university life virtually, but it's a credit to the career staff and faculty that we've pivoted, that we have tried our best to deliver a high quality experience, even if it's mediated electronically. And so I want to ask another question, and it's about looking towards the future. And the future is not distant, it's actually looming quite rapidly, because we'll be starting instruction in about 2.5 weeks or so. And I don't know about you, but I'm really interested in learning, how are you preparing? How are you preparing to support resiliency? How are you preparing to promote community, thriving, and wellness? And I mention these aspects because in some sense, we've learned so much during the past 18 months about each other and ourselves in this campus. And are we going to use that experience to inform how we prepare for the coming academic year? And so I want to begin with you, Amanda. How is staff assembly not only learning from the past, but preparing to support resiliency, community thriving, and wellness?
Sure. Yeah. So we have learned a lot, as everyone has, experiencing remote working for a lot of us. And so there's been a lot of things that we've learned about our virtual events, and, really how to reach staff. Our former chair, Connie Chang, she brought to life our special committee on campus culture. And some folks may have attended those events in the past year. Those were the conversations for change on improving the racial climate at UCI. So that committee is continuing to serve this year, and we're going to see more content coming out from them. So I'm excited to see where that takes us in this second year of this new committee. And we also look forward to Staff Appreciation Week, which is coming up. It's going to be the week of October 11th. And similar to last year's unique pandemic experience, we're going to hold the Excellence in Leadership Awards virtually. And so those folks who nominated someone, look out for some communication from us. And that's, that's always a great annual event to recognize those staff leaders who go above and beyond and really exemplify excellence. And, some of the other things we learned, speaking of excellence in leadership, was that, for the first year, we took the step to try to reduce any implicit bias by redacting the names and titles of those who were nominated. So our review committee didn't see that part of the content, and they could hopefully, not have that affect any decision they might make for selection.
Wow. Amanda, you just triggered something in me, excitement, because what you just showed is how you are applying our understanding of implicit bias to a selection process that can be biased.
Mm-hmm.
And I think you really, through the staff assembly, are really making a very positive impact while making an example that we can apply these best practices wherever we are, right? I want to next turn to Joanna Ho, the chair of the Academic Senate, in terms of, right now there's approximately 1,450 Senate members representing new faculty to faculty who've been there for many years. That reflect the broad dimensions of human diversity. And so knowing that we're going to be starting the academic year, what are ways in which the Academic Senate, both working within its organization, but also in partnership with the campus, how are you preparing to support resiliency, community thriving, and wellness?
Yeah, thanks, Doug. Okay, this year, once we return to the campus, okay, and actually just like you say, 2 weeks, right? The Senate Council on Equity Inclusion will continue to fulfill its charge to advise the administration on matters related to equity, inclusion, and diversity. One specific area slated for discussion this fall is the undergrad transfer admission guarantee program and its impact on diversity. And this council really look forward to discussing this program with the campus partners in admissions and the enrollment management. The other one is about the student mental health advising and mentoring needs. And several of our councils, especially Council on Teaching, Learning, Student Experience, and the Graduate Council, they will continue to advocate on behalf of the students for those resources they need to be successful during their time at UCI. And the other one we have been thinking is the Senate will continue monitoring the campus safety and policing, especially use of unnecessary force, stopping certain ethnic groups without any evidence, and the racial profiling. So we will partner with the PSAC, the Public Safety Advisory Committee, and also your work group to bring more transparency and equity to campus policing. This is what we are thinking. Well, for moving forward, this is a council's will do.
Terrific. Thank you so much for that. I think each of those topics, and I'm sure there are others, are so important because at the core of all of them are people. And not only people, but how can we establish conditions for individual to maximize their potential? And I just want to tell you how grateful I am that we're elevating attention to mental health within the Academic Senate, particularly as it relates to our students. I think it's so important now more than ever, given just the sort of relentlessness of the COVID impacts. Right? And last but not least, but I want to turn to Edgar Dormitorio, who again is a chief of staff as the ABC in the Division of Student Affairs, which is one of the largest divisions on campus that has several hundred employees who really serve as the principal touch point for 30,000 people. Now, like Edgar, I lost my hair too, but in his role, I can see how I would pull my hair out. But in all seriousness, I just want to publicly thank Edgar and the division for what they have been doing. It means so much because it exemplifies community thriving and wellness. And so I want to ask the same question to you, Edgar. How is the division preparing to support resiliency, community thriving and wellness in the coming academic year?
Well, first, let me point out, I really appreciate the, a note to our hairstyle here, Doug. So I always want to take the opportunity to mention that. But, I do want to kind of connect this a bit to your first question around sort of what we're surprised by with the students in terms of the resiliency and the work ethic. I think for the most part, our students and our staff have demonstrated that, but we've also kept a close eye on those who have not fared so well during the pandemic. And so, our team of folks in the Wellness and Counseling Center cluster with our social workers and our counselors who are really trying to fill the gaps for some of these students who are really struggling, whether they're having issues at home. Because remember, we sent all our students home, and sometimes home was not the best place for them. So, part of the work that we're doing in student affairs is those three pillars. We're building communities, we're supporting students to thrive here, we're supporting their wellness, and we do all of those things, I think, very well. And one example of that, of course, is our preparations for housing. Right, we're getting ready to move in all these students back to the campus, and we're going to be at full capacity. Right, so all of the work that we're doing to help them get the things that they normally would get in the beginning of the school year with the communities that they create in their residence halls, right? But with all of the requirements that they have to have in place before they come to the campus, like our testing and vaccination record uploads, and then for them to develop and grow there as a student, well, they'll find out about opportunities like leadership opportunities on campus, resource centers. They'll meet people that they've never met before in their lives. They'll live with them. They'll share food with them. So it's an incredible opportunity. We're trying to balance that, of course, with all of the safety requirements that we have this year. I think some of the things that we're doing for our units is that a lot of them are offering their services both in person and also online. Yeah. And so it's meeting students where they're most comfortable, right? So.
Well, thank you. I want to pivot, excuse me, but I'll use that word, to another question. And it really connects back to Dr. Banaji's presentation in the morning. And it's a question that one of our audience members submitted, and it has to do with implicit bias. And so here is the question. What do you believe is your responsibility when you see or believe implicit biases have influenced a decision or an outcome? Do you let it go and just keep it to yourself? Do you have a side conversation and share what you think with friends at happy hour or other social gathering?
Mhm.
Do you discuss your perception with the person who may not know they are expressing what you believe to be an implicit bias? And I think this is a particularly illuminating question because for over 18 months, we haven't been in person. And if we're not aware of what implicit bias is, we run the risk of unintentionally engaging in it. And so this question, I think, is particularly valuable because it's asking, well, what do you do
Mhm.
when you see, observe what you believe to be implicit bias? And I want to begin with you, Joanna.
Okay, I believe I am responsible for pointing out implicit biases right away when I see them.
Mhm.
Of course, that is easier said than done, okay? And let me, like many assistant professors, I kept it to myself when I saw implicit biases because I was worried about retaliation from senior faculty or administrators. In my tenure promotion case decades ago, a junior colleague pointed out the dean's implicit biases against another minority faculty and me. So unfortunately, he was retaliated against for taking that stand. However, I was deeply inspired by that colleague's bravery and determined to be a voice for others whenever I see implicit biases.
Wow. I want to build on Johanna's comment and reach out to you, Edgar, because implicit bias, is a valid dimension of human bias, and often what one sees might not register with another person, and so this is a variation on this question. How do you, in a supervisorial position, deal with concerns around implicit bias?
Yeah, I really appreciate that question because it offered some potential solutions. I really do think, of course, in our capacity, these issues have to be addressed if we see them. But I think how you address them will depend on the context of the situation, right? I've been in hiring committees, and I've seen before me colleagues do a very good job of diplomatically and tactfully addressing a blind spot of another individual on that committee. It's like, I think that style is always appreciated because I think in most cases, folks are there to learn if they have a blind spot, if they're not looking out for something that is mentioned. Oftentimes I find myself pulling folks aside or talking with them in private about an issue, and sometimes that helps. So really, for me, it depends on the context to be able to address the situation.
Well, Amanda, you mentioned earlier how Staff Assembly adopted one of the best practices relative to implicit bias, and in your estimation, was that hard to do? And to what extent was there a conversation about doing it? Did some folks feel that it was unnecessary? Did folks raise concerns? And at the end of the process, are people more comfortable with it?
Yeah, thanks for inquiring about it. So it really, everyone was quite supportive about the concept of it. I think the part in terms of redacting, because you are talking about a large volume of documents, it was more the logistics of it. So, figuring out, we want to make this happen, and then how do we go about doing that? And I think that's the part that in some of those types of situations, maybe people don't take that step because of the extra work that it takes the first time. So, we made a plan where one person was separate from the committee and wouldn't serve on the review committee and would be the person redacting. And like I said, everyone was really receptive to the idea. And we met after the review committee met, so we could kind of discuss like what was everyone's thoughts about it. Did they feel like it helped them be, kind of recognize areas that maybe they would have had bias? And people seemed pretty receptive and open that, hey, once you see people's titles, or if you knew someone but you couldn't tell that from the materials, afterward they really did feel that they could have been influenced, and definitely in a subconscious kind of way that it wouldn't have been easy to I guess recognize those things in the moment. And it's so much better if you can change that systems, that framework, so that they don't have to make that conscious thought about it. It's just removed and it can be neutral.
Yeah. And one lesson that I think that I'm deriving from your experience, Amanda, through staff assembly, is that implicit bias is something that we all are liable to. It's a human condition. It's baked into our evolution, right? That the mind rapidly processes information, slots it in these convenient categories, almost unconsciously, in fact, unconsciously, right? And so one of the best practices to interrupt implicit bias is to slow down, right? Another one is to clarify a process in the ways that you described, Amanda. So people understand not only what are the expectations as a reviewer, but also what are the expectations as an applicant, right? And that we have clear milestones. Another area that you referred to that's another best practice, Amanda, is consistency in evaluation, right? Because once you deviate from clear criteria or a rubric for evaluating an applicant, that's an opportunity for our implicit biases. One example could be this person on their application says that they went to a USC. I don't like USC. And so I might not spend as much time on it. I don't, well, that's just an example. USC is a fine place, right? But my point is that can trigger within an individual a presumption about that particular institution, and as a result, undermine the sort of credibility of that applicant. I want to pivot, there's that word again, and point out an aspect that's, I think, particularly important as we enter into in-person learning and working again. And that is our campus and our stated values in many of our processes is relentlessly committed to inclusive excellence. Okay? And yet, our actions can sometimes contradict that, right? And sometimes those actions are indicative of implicit bias. And so I'm going to pose 4 questions, and there's really no need for an answer, but 4 questions that I think are worthwhile to consider when we are using our discretion, right? The first question is, who is our community? Right? The second question is, are they thriving? And the third is, how do we know? And then the final question is, how can we improve? And so I want to turn to a chat question that Mandy Mount shared because it's particularly relevant here. when we think about implicit bias, specifically how we see and how we interpret, it may not be accurate. It makes me think about how powerful it can be for us to consider how making personal identifiers such as pronouns visible can raise awareness where much implicit bias can occur and affect our ability to create a truly inclusive campus. And so in some sense, and Mandy, if I'm not accurately reflecting your comment and question, in this case, by sharing our preferred pronouns, we're also describing that gender identity is really indicative of how we choose to represent ourselves. And that should be indicative of a campus that really aspires to an inclusive culture, right? That includes dimensions of diversity that include members of the transgender community or the gender binary community, right? And so I think it's a valuable question to be an ambassador, if you will, of inclusive excellence, because that may signal to other people a real desire for them to fully bring their whole self to campus, whether as a student or as an employee. And so colleagues, we're about 2 minutes before our scheduled sort of transition to the next section. And I just want to ask a very challenging question and give you less than 30 seconds. And I'm going to pick Amanda. The question is, I have no idea which speaker can answer this, but the research I've been doing is leading me to believe that systemic approach to exclusion for purposes of resource grabbing appears to look intentional and organized. I find it hard to believe people were so advanced at that time, and yet here we are. Can someone shed light on this? The idea that we have so much abundance, but it's skewed in its distribution.
Sure. Yeah, I don't know if I'm fully understanding which instance they're talking about, if it's something pertaining to UCI or something more broad. But I think in terms of, I think we can definitely tackle and approach situations as we experience them. So if we individually see areas where we feel people are being excluded, that we, address those as we've mentioned before, and then as staff really utilize those resources that we have on campus. So if we want to consult Office of Ombuds or OEOD or other offices that to utilize all those resources, that if it's something individual that we've experienced or seen, that we can tackle and really gather all of the information. And sometimes there's patterns to what people are experiencing. And so if you see it in one place, some of those central offices will really see more of that bigger pattern that they, depending on if you're, putting in a full report or just seeking advice confidentially. But I feel like there's a network of people out there that want to help and solve some of these things. So it's just important to speak up when we can.
Yeah, thank you. I think that's excellent advice. I think there are many people in offices who are committed to the mission of the campus. And I think it's worthwhile always to reach out. And I think for the most part, people will do their level best to provide answers, at least that they're aware of. We're now at 1:31, a little over our scheduled transition time. I want to thank our panelists, Professor Joanna Ho, who is the chair of the Academic Senate, Amanda Garcia-Hall, who is representing Staff Assembly, and of course, Edgar Dormitorio, who's representing the Division of Student Affairs. I want to thank them all and their constituencies, and we're really looking forward to a terrific new academic year. So thank you again.
Yeah,
Thank you.
And so at this time, we're going to return to implicit bias. And as Dr. Banaji mentioned this morning, we have a short clip to view, and we'll use that as a jumping off point for conversation.
Okay, so I will take us to the Outsmarting Human Minds resource, and that's going to be also cited on our website. And we're going to look at one particular really brief clip. Who are we helping? So I'm actually going to exit for just a quick moment to make sure I have some sound on. So hold on, please.
Wow. That was a very arresting 1 minute wordless film about why we help. And so I want to open up the conversation to your questions and comments about why do we help? What drives us to help other people?
So can I start out and just kick off the idea with, many times I think it's about access. Who has access to you, who can reach you, who can, has that permission almost sometimes to outreach. And I think that's why for me, I look at an organization and think of how do we provide everyone with that sort of level access, that easy way of incorporating. I see some additional comments coming now too.
I want to build on what Marguerite mentioned. Is there any resonance with the idea that we help people who are similar to us? Is that true in your experience? That awkward silence on Zoom. It's like being in a seminar room or a classroom where it gets really quiet. And then it's like a standoff to see who's going to give the answer. Manek writes, does political correctness also drive bias? That's a good question. If you don't mind, I'd like to know, what do you mean by political correctness?
Yeah, by political correctness, I would mean, that you don't want to create a problem speaking something that is not currently in vogue, when people are, won't say something because of being offensive to someone or some group,
Mhm.
that type of thing, sensitiveness to that.
Mhm. It's interesting. I mean, I really like the question, but I really don't know. Mata Jafari believes it does. Mata, would you mind sort of elaborating?
Thank you, Doug. I think sometimes we hide behind political correctness because we don't want to be brave.
Can you give me an example? Not to probe too much, but
Like, for instance, you are in a faculty meeting or in a meeting with graduate students, and somebody says something outrageous that is filled with, I mean, we don't do these things overtly anymore, but it has an undertone of racism or bias, and we are quiet because we want to be politically correct. And I think this is also pretty common with, with colleagues who are going through tenure and they are assistant professors. So they are really trying to be very politically correct so that they don't create any issues or hinder their promotion and their tenure process.
thank you for that. And I have a better understanding of political correctness, because in some sense, it's the recognition of a type of power, right? And you want to align with it, rather than having it be directed at you, right? And that will cause a person to curb taking certain actions, right? And I can certainly see that as creating a real challenge for people to want to help, because it might trigger retaliation. I want to turn to Doug Everhart, who has his hand up. Doug?
Yeah, thanks, Doug. I think it's not only about who we want to help and the actions that internally we're deciding, but it's about our perceptions of what other people think. So I think natural altruism is a human nature type of response. We want to help other people as a natural human tendency, but we also care a great deal about what other people think. So I facilitate a bystander intervention training called Step Up UCI. We talk about implicit bias and social identifiers and how it impacts our actions. And I think there's a lot of pressure that goes on in our head on taking action and what other people are going to think of that action. So it kind of follows up on this political correctness thing in how we define and perceive what other people are going to think of our actions. So I think that's a big part of it as well.
I want to thank you, Doug. I want to turn to Bammy Haggins, who has her hand up.
Hi. One of the things I kept thinking about as we're having this discussion about political correctness is how that phrase gets mobilized by so many people in so many different ways. And I think because of that, I think political correctness can become a dodge for just about everybody. That and when I think about those who, particularly in the context of my graduate students or junior colleagues, often I think about the way I can help in relation to those folks who are coming from the same kind of marginalized position. And that doesn't just mean in terms of race or gender. It can also have to do with being first generation. I'm a first generation college student and a first generation academic. And I've been in many, many spaces where I'm the only one who fits those categories. So when I speak to or find out that people who are coming up are in a similar situation, I want to try to give them the kind of guidance that I was given by others who are also in a similar situation on how to navigate those waters. And that's also true in relationship to graduate students, because I mean, none of us have a singular identity. So there are ways in which those indexes actually do resonate for multiple different groups. And the affinity towards another group where being a visible, visible difference is a way in which people can be judged, or the way in which it can trigger bias. I kind of feel like it's my responsibility to try to help them navigate what exists. The idea of things getting better and improving, and I thought the lecture this morning was incredible. And it also, I think, even gave me ideas about how we gaslight ourselves by accepting the ways that others see us or others construct us in relationship to their ideas of quality and rigor. And so I guess it's, but I always have problems with that idea of political correctness, because I think depending on which position on the political spectrum you occupy, it has a very different resonance. And it's a tool for very different things.
Sure.
Does that make sense?
It does. And I think, I think that the notion, I would say, instead of using political correctness, I would say UCI is many things: a research institution, an employer. It's also a social organization. It's about people, right? And within that, we have different roles and responsibilities that are very formal. And yet, there is within the organization implicit knowledges, implicit privileges that can really create real tension between our stated values and our experience, right? And so I think Veronica made a point that echoes something that you mentioned, Bambi, and that is that we tend to sort of connect with people who have similar experiences that we know. But she makes this, I think, really thoughtful point, but maybe at the basis of being able to help people who are not like you, there needs to be ability to empathize with other people's struggles and difficulties. And that tends to go back to those 4 questions that I mentioned towards the end of the other panel. Who is our community? Are they thriving? How do we know? And how can we improve? And those 4 questions aren't necessarily narrowly tailored, but actually can be applied to a much broader community than one that we know or identify with. I want to turn to Amanda because she has her hand up.
Sure. I think the conversation was just making me pose maybe another question, or it was making me think about what are the different kinds of help when we're talking about help. Kind of Bambi was expressing a little bit about maybe mentoring and helping others versus the help that was kind of talked about with being interview or something where you're giving someone an extra advantage or unintentionally helping them further. I feel like maybe there's a distinction in what we're saying and when we're helping people extra than others, and kind of, I don't know, that feels like something for me to think about too.
Yeah, yeah. And I want to recognize my colleague, Jane Snapper, who added a comment that I think is particularly worthwhile to consider: the historical context of the term political correctness. She writes, political correct is jargon in my experience that has a history since the late 80s and 90s of being used to dismiss discussions of difference, including racial and gender inequalities, and to name privileges such as ableism, right? And so there's a thing called political correctness that's out there, right? I think many of the elements of our conversation really is about how do we translate our avowed commitments to equity, diversity, inclusion into our day-to-day activities, right? And I think that's that's a fundamental challenge, right? At the core of that challenge, in order to approach it, I think, is that we have to learn, right? We simply can't assume that because we have a relatively diverse campus, that we don't need to think about it. Right? We can't just, expect equity for ourselves in an affirmative and supportive environment without defending it for other people, right? It's one thing to be in a very diverse organization with a lot of different people that reflects a broad cross-section of diversity in society, but it's quite true that in even diverse organizations, people experience tremendous isolation, in part because we're not building connection, inclusion, and belonging. And so I want to thank all of you for sort of taking this time to sort of be in dialogue and conversation about outsmarting human minds, our own, to understand implicit bias, to figure out how to interrupt it, but above all, see this as a knowledge base, as a competency that we can apply to inclusive excellence, right? That we can learn more about each other, that we can treat each other better by creating an affirmative and supportive environment, that we can create a greater sense of belonging, right? By taking that brave step and learning about someone else, asking them how they're doing, and how you can help if the situation calls for it. And so I want to sort of begin to sort of transition to the final minutes of this institute. And I just want to say that I'm encouraged by the start of the academic year. I know it's a challenging time, but I'm convinced that we're ready, that we extend each other grace, that we support each other, that we use this moment to practice inclusive excellence and not revert back. And so looking ahead, there's a few things that I just want to sort of leave as coming attractions. The first is we'll be having this fall quarter a campus safety town hall that will sort of address how the campus is implementing the recommendations for campus safety. It grows out of creating a framework for safety where we can bring our whole selves and thrive at UCI. The second coming attraction that I want to urge all of you to consider, and if you've done it already, please invite others, is to participate in the Inclusive Excellence Certificate Program. It's free. It's open to staff and faculty, undergraduates and graduate students. Already 400 people have completed it. It's a total of 20 hours, 10 hours per course, just 2. And I also want to urge you to consider enrolling in, if you have not, the Black Thriving Initiative modules on anti-Blackness in the United States. We launched these modules to create a platform for members of the campus community to understand what anti-Blackness is, to understand why people are protesting in the street, to understand why is it necessary to demand that Black Lives Matter, and how we can become authentic allies. These modules are 5 hours each. You can take them in any order. They're free. Enrollment is open. And finally, I want to give you a real coming attraction. In winter 2022, we'll be administering our climate survey, and we'll be communicating later as that date approaches. But these surveys are so important to understand what you think, how you are experiencing community thriving and wellness here at UCI. And so those are just 4 coming attractions. They're available in the chat as well. You can visit our website, the Office of Inclusive Excellence. But before we end, I just want to acknowledge my 10 members, Dr. Marguerite Monet-Hamarth, my colleague MJ Tudayi, and other members of the Office of Inclusive Excellence. I especially want to acknowledge our panelists from Staff Assembly, the Academic Senate, as well as the Division of Student Affairs. And of course, I want to send invisible warm thanks to Professor Mahzarin Banaji for her terrific presentation this morning on implicit bias. As something to bear in mind, we'll be posting Dr. Banaji's slide deck so you can consult it at your leisure. It'll be available on our website. And with that, I want to thank you all again for joining us. We look forward to a terrific new academic year. And let's be in this together.